On my 67th birthday, my daughter-in-law handed me a wrinkled plastic bag, the kind you get when you forget to bring a reusable tote to the grocery store. Inside was a novelty coffee mug printed with a cartoon cat and the words, "World's Okayest Grandma." She didn't bother to wrap it. She didn't bother to smile. She leaned back against the kitchen counter, crossed her arms, and muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "Don't expect much." And I looked down at that mug, at the crooked little cat, at the cheap glaze already cracking at the rim, and something very quiet happened inside me. Not a break, not a boil. Something far more dangerous than either of those things. A decision. There is a lesson I wish someone had handed me the way that woman handed me that bag years earlier and without the contempt. Love freely given is a gift, but love that is systematically taken for granted is something else entirely. It becomes a liability. It becomes a resource someone else is drawing down without your permission. And the moment you understand that, you stop calling it love, and you start calling it what it is. And once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I'm 67 years old. I was married to a good man for 31 years, and I have been a widow for the past 4. I own my home, my car, my savings account, and my mornings. On the day of that birthday, I also owned a plan, though I didn't know yet how precisely I would execute it. What I knew, standing there in my own kitchen holding a cracked cat mug, was that everything was about to change. If anything I've just said sounds familiar, if you've ever been handed the smallest, most careless version of yourself back by someone who should have known better, then stay with me. I think you'll find yourself in this story somewhere. And if you've been watching this channel for a while, you already know that I don't raise my voice and I don't make scenes. I make decisions. Leave me a comment below if you've ever received a gift so thoughtless it told you everything you needed to know about a person. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing because I promise the rest of this story is worth every minute. I want to tell you about the life I had before that birthday, the life I'd built carefully, quietly, and mostly alone since my husband Richard passed. Richard was a structural engineer. He believed in good foundations, in measuring twice before cutting once, in never leaving a load-bearing wall without support. I absorbed those principles the way you absorb anything from a person you love for 3 decades, without noticing, until one day you realize they've simply become part of how you think. After he died, I sold the larger house we'd shared in the suburbs, paid off the remaining mortgage on the lake house, a smaller, sturdier place I'd always loved more anyway, and moved in permanently. I planted a kitchen garden along the south-facing fence. I learned to make bread by hand. I joined a Tuesday morning book club and a Thursday evening watercolor class, and I discovered, somewhere between the yeast and the cadmium yellow, that I was not as diminished by solitude as I had feared. I was, in fact, expanding into it. My retirement from 28 years as a hospital administrator had given me a pension that covered my needs cleanly, with enough left over for small pleasures. Good olive oil, new novels in hardcover, the occasional weekend at an inn where someone else made the bed. I was not wealthy, but I was, for the first time in my adult life, financially self-sufficient in a way that felt like clean air. I had no one to answer to, no shared account to negotiate, no other person's credit card statement arriving to reorder my priorities. It was a Tuesday in late September when it happened, the morning that would eventually lead to that birthday. I was sitting on the back porch with coffee, the real coffee I make in the small French press I bought myself, not the instant granules that had started appearing in my pantry around the same time Diane moved in, watching the light on the water. The lake was doing what lakes do in early autumn, going silver and flat before noon, full of a stillness that feels almost rehearsed. A dragonfly landed on the rim of the wooden railing. I was thinking about nothing in particular, and then my son Marcus called. He called the way he always called when there was something he wanted, without preamble, without asking whether I had a moment, launching directly into the situation as though my attention were already waiting for him on his end of the line. He told me Diane's lease was up at the end of October. He told me the new apartment they'd applied for had fallen through. Some issue with her credit, though he didn't use those words. He said the landlord was impossible, and he told me it would only be temporary. 6 weeks, maybe 8, just until they found something. The lake house had the spare room. I was there alone. It made sense. Diane was my son's wife of 3 years, And I will be accurate rather than unkind when I say that our relationship had always been something I managed rather than something I enjoyed. She was a person who moved through the world with a specific kind of confidence that I have come to recognize. The confidence that comes not from competence, but from having found early in life that other people will absorb the consequences of her choices if she simply presents her needs loudly enough and long enough. She was pleasant when she wanted something. She was cold when she didn't. She treated my son with the same alternating current, warm, then cool, then warm again. And Marcus, who had always needed approval the way some people need altitude, found the cycle irresistible rather than exhausting. I had never been her favorite person. I understood why. I didn't perform the kind of unconditional, enthusiastic approval she expected from the women around her. I was cordial. I was fair. But I was also clear-eyed. And people who require an audience find clear-eyed observers deeply uncomfortable. Now, I want to explain something about how this situation had reached the point it had because it did not happen overnight. No pattern of this kind ever does. It accumulated the way debt accumulates, quietly, in small increments, each one individually defensible, all of them together becoming something you cannot ignore once you finally add them up. When Marcus and Diane married, I gave them a cash gift, a generous one. I did not give it because I was asked, though I was. I gave it because Richard and I had set aside money for each of our children for exactly that kind of beginning. And it felt right to honor that intention, even though Richard wasn't there to hand it over himself. I thought of it as a gift in the truest sense, freely given, no strings, no expectation of return. What I did not understand then was that Diane received it as something different. She received it as proof of what I was willing to do, which she immediately converted in her mind into proof of what I could be expected to do. The next request came 4 months later. Diane had started a small online business selling handmade jewelry. Actually well crafted, I'll give her that. And she needed a quiet space to photograph her pieces. My house, she said, had the best natural light. Could she come on Saturdays? Just a few hours. I said yes. I set up the kitchen table with a neutral cloth and moved my things to the side and made tea and kept out of the way. She came for 11 Saturdays in a row without ever saying thank you or offering to wash the cup she used. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself she was young and focused and building something. I told myself the things you tell yourself when you have decided in advance to be patient. Then there was the Thanksgiving incident. Marcus and Diane were supposed to host. 2 weeks before, Diane told Marcus she was overwhelmed, which I believed because she was genuinely overwhelmed quite often. And the hosting shifted to me. I cooked for 11 people. I bought the turkey, the wine, the linen napkins I'd been saving for a nicer occasion. Diane arrived 40 minutes late, sat at the head of the table as though she had arranged it all, and accepted compliments on the meal without correcting anyone's assumption. I said nothing. I was by then very practiced at saying nothing. What recently shifted, what made the difference between the woman I was then and the woman I became standing in my kitchen with that mug, was a structural change. The last of Richard's life insurance policies paid out in August of that year. The amount was not enormous, but it was real. And it landed in my account and sat there looking at me. And what I felt was not grief, though grief was there too. What I felt was clarity. That money was mine. It was the last form of his ongoing care for me, delivered from a decade before his death, in the form of a policy he'd chosen carefully when we were still young enough to think we had all the time in the world. And something about receiving it made me look at every other resource I had: the house, the pension, the car, the time, the knowledge, the patience, and ask, for the first time with real intention, who am I giving this to, and why? My birthday is the 14th of October. Marcus and Diane had been at the lake house for 11 days by then. The room at the end of the hall, what I had always thought of as the reading room, where I kept my bookshelves and my good lamp and the armchair Richard and I had bought at an estate sale in Vermont, had been borrowed within the first 48 hours. Diane needed a workspace, she said. The boxes went in first, then a folding table, then a ring light on a tripod that stayed on until past 11 on nights when she was working. I slept with a pillow over my head twice before I said anything. And when I said something, Marcus looked at me with that particular expression of his on pained, apologetic, but ultimately passive, and said, "She's trying really hard, Mom." The birthday dinner was not planned. I had not asked for one, and I want to be fair and say that Marcus did cook, or attempted to cook. Pasta with a jarred sauce he'd warmed on the stove, and a salad from a bag. He put a candle in a dinner roll because there was no cake. He sang, a little off key, and for a moment I felt the uncomplicated warmth of being his mother and not his landlord. Then Diane slid the plastic bag across the table and said what she said, and the warmth receded the way water recedes before a wave. I set the mug down on the table. I did not say anything immediately. That is not a technique I was trained in. It is simply how I am made. I looked at the mug and I looked at Diane, who was already reaching for her phone, and I thought, this is not new. This is simply the most legible version of what has always been true. The contempt was not born at this table tonight. It was only visible here, stripped of the social pressure to disguise it. What she had said was not a full sentence. It was a murmur, a half laugh, the kind of dismissal you make when you want to communicate something but also want to deny having communicated it. That is a very specific type of behavior, and I want to name it clearly, not to be harsh, but because naming things accurately is what lets you respond to them accurately. What Diane had perfected over 3 years of marriage and 11 days of residence in my house was a form of incremental contempt, the slow, consistent communication that the person being generous is somehow less than the person receiving the generosity. Psychologists sometimes call this dynamic entitlement inversion, though I didn't have that phrase at the time. What I had was the felt sense of it, the understanding that in Diane's private accounting of the world, my giving had not made her feel grateful. It had made her feel superior. Because if someone gives you things so readily, the unconscious conclusion is that those things and that person are not worth much. The thing about having given freely and consistently over years is that it creates, without your consent, an invisible policy, not a legal document, nothing anyone has signed, but a behavioral contract reinforced by every repetition that says, this is how things are here. The house is available, the kitchen is open, the account is accessible, the person is patient. And once that policy is established, any attempt to revise it is experienced by the other party not as a reasonable correction, but as a shocking violation. They do not feel they are losing something extra. They feel they are being robbed of something guaranteed. I want to say something here because I think it matters for anyone in a similar situation who may be wondering about their footing. The home you own, whether you bought it outright, whether you inherited it, whether you mortgaged it for 30 years, is yours. The law is not ambiguous on this. You are not required to admit any person, including adult children or their spouses, as residents, and you are not required to maintain any particular set of conditions inside your own home for guests or family members who are living there temporarily. The right to determine who lives in your space, on what terms, and for how long is not a moral luxury, available only to people who have been sufficiently wronged. It is a legal and personal baseline. I say this not to encourage hostility, but because I think many women of my generation were raised to believe that the correct response to a family member's housing problem was to make their own home available without reservation or condition. That is generosity. It is not an obligation. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and I had spent years treating them as the same. After Marcus went to wash the dishes and Diane disappeared into the reading room with her phone, I sat at the table for a long time. I was not composing a speech, I was taking inventory. And the inventory, when I completed it honestly, was not flattering to the situation I had allowed to develop. The next morning, I woke before either of them and drove to the hardware store before it opened. I sat in the parking lot with my coffee thermos and my list, and when the lights came on inside, I went in and bought what I needed. I was back at the house by 9, and by the time Diane came downstairs at 10:15, there were things that had changed. The first thing I did was address the kitchen. I had a small secondary refrigerator in the utility room. I'd kept it as overflow for holidays and preserves, and I moved it into the corner of my bedroom. I transferred my things, The French press coffee, the good yogurt, the specific brand of butter I buy, the vegetables from my garden, the fruit I'd bought at the farmer's market on Saturday. I left in the main refrigerator a container of eggs, a block of basic cheese, a bag of apples, the condiments, the jarred pasta sauce Marcus favored. Reasonable provisions, not empty, but no longer mine to be used without asking. I stocked a small basket with my own tea, my own crackers, my own chocolate, the good kind I order online. And I put it on the shelf in my bedroom next to the mini fridge. And before I made my own breakfast, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee from my press and I ate an egg I had scrambled myself in my own pan, at my own stove, in my own kitchen. And I felt for the first time in 11 days that I was in my home. When Diane opened the refrigerator at 10:25 and stood in front of it with the long, disappointed stare of someone expecting more, I said from my chair at the table, "Good morning." She turned and looked at me. She looked at the refrigerator. She looked at me again. "Where's your yogurt?" she asked. The specific yogurt she meant was the kind I bought from a small local dairy, the good thick kind that cost $4 a container, and she had been eating it since day 3 without comment or replacement. "In my room, Ash," I said. There was a pause. "You moved your food to your room." "Some of it," I said. "The main fridge has what you need for basics." I returned to my book. She stood there for another moment and then poured herself a glass of water and went back upstairs. The second change came that same afternoon. I had a locksmith in by 2 o'clock. Marcus was at work. Diane was in the reading room with the door closed. I had the lock changed on that room, which was, I want to be clear, not a bedroom, not a room any guest had been assigned, but my private study, which I had not given permission to occupy and had received no offer to vacate once I'd expressed discomfort. I also had new locks put on the door to my bedroom and on the door to the utility room where the washer and dryer sat, simply because those were my rooms, and there was no reason anyone needed access to them unsupervised. I kept the key. I left the rest of the house, the kitchen, the living room, the assigned guest room where Marcus and Diane were sleeping, exactly as it had been. When Diane came downstairs at 3 and tried the reading room door and found it locked, she knocked. Then she knocked again. Then she came to find me where I was sitting in the living room reading, and she stood in the doorway with the particular look of someone who has decided they are the wronged party before the conversation has started. "You locked the room," she said. "I did," I said. "All my equipment is in there." "You're welcome to take it out," I said. "I'll unlock it for you now if you'd like." "And then what?" "And then you'll have your equipment, and the room will be available to me again." She looked at me for a long moment, with the expression that I imagine preceded many conversations in her life, where she had gotten her way. The gathering charge of someone who believes indignation alone is a reasonable argument. Then she said, "Marcus isn't going to be happy about this." "That's between the two of you," I said, and I looked back at my book. That evening, Marcus came home and sought me out in the kitchen while I was making my dinner. He had the look he always had when he'd been briefed by Diane before speaking to me, a kind of preloaded patience, a bracing. He said, "Mom, I think we need to talk about what happened today." I finished stirring what I was stirring. I set down the spoon. I turned to face him and I gave him my full attention, which is more than he'd given me for most of the previous 11 days. "All right," I said. He told me that Diane felt disrespected. He told me that the lock felt aggressive. He told me that they were guests and they understood that, but that guests deserved a certain basic level of, and here he searched for the word, normalcy. I let him finish. Then I said, "Marcus, the reading room was not given to Diane. She moved her things in without asking. I asked her twice if she'd consider moving back to the guest room, and both times she said she needed the light. I changed the lock on a room that is mine to lock. As for the food in the refrigerator, I've been buying everything in that kitchen since you arrived. That's fine. You're my guests and I'm happy to have you. But I'm not required to give all of it freely without any arrangement between us. And I chose to keep my personal items in my own space." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and this is the sentence I had been waiting, without knowing it, to hear out loud for a long time. "I just think you could be a little more flexible." Flexible. as though I were a rule someone had applied too rigidly, as though I were an obstacle rather than a person. I looked at my son, whom I love, and I said, Marcus, this house is the only thing in my life that is entirely mine. Your father isn't here. My career is behind me. The years of doing everything for everyone are behind me. This house and what happens inside it is what I have. I am not going to negotiate my ownership of it as though ownership is a preference I can be persuaded out of. I want you here. I want you comfortable. I do not want to be managed in my own kitchen. I picked up my spoon. Dinner is at 7 if you'd like to join me. He did join me for dinner. Diane ate in the reading room, which I had unlocked when she asked me to, and had locked again once she'd removed her equipment. 3 days after the lock incident, I was reviewing my bank account online. Something I do every few weeks is a habit Richard instilled in me, the kind of man who believed in checking his foundations. I was looking at the previous month's charges, and I found one I did not recognize. A charge from a streaming platform bundle I had never signed up for, billed to the debit card I kept linked to the account I used for household expenses. The charge had been there for 2 months. Beneath it, a charge from a meal delivery service I had used once in the first week and had never enrolled in a subscription for. Below that, a charge for a storage unit, a local storage facility 3 miles from the house. The total was not catastrophic. It was $187 across 2 months. But $187 had been taken from my account without my knowledge or consent, which meant someone had access to a card number they should not have had. I sat very still for a moment. I thought about the times I'd set that debit card on the counter. I thought about the times I had used it in the kitchen while Diane was present. I thought about how easy it is, in a small house where you trust the people staying with you, to be less careful than you should be. I did not confront anyone. I picked up the phone and called my bank. I explained that there were charges I had not authorized. I canceled that specific card immediately and requested a new one sent to a P.O. box I had maintained since the years when I was traveling for work. I changed the PIN on the account. I moved the account itself to a different branch level, adding a secondary verification requirement for any online access. I disputed the charges. The bank was efficient. The whole thing took 40 minutes. When I put the phone down, I felt the particular satisfaction of a problem correctly solved. Not dramatically, not noisily, just solved. Then I opened my laptop and I canceled the streaming bundle and the meal delivery subscription myself because both were enrolled under my email address, which told me that whoever had set them up had simply used my existing account. I reset the password on every streaming service in the house. I reset the Wi-Fi network password that same afternoon, a new password I typed into my own devices and did not share. When Diane came downstairs and tried to connect her phone and found it wouldn't connect, she asked me if the Wi-Fi was down. I updated the password, I said. The old one was too simple. I've been meaning to do it. She waited for me to tell her the new one. I told her I'd get to it later. I never did. The car is where I want to linger for a moment because the car is the part that surprised even me, the part where I realized the extent to which things had been silently reclassified. My car is a reliable 4-door sedan, 7 years old, which I maintain carefully and which has never given me serious trouble. When Marcus and Diane moved in, Marcus had his own car. Diane did not. She'd let her insurance lapse the previous year and had been sharing his. What I hadn't registered in the first few days of the arrangement was that Diane had begun using my car on mornings when Marcus drove himself to work. Not borrowing it, using it. I'd come downstairs to find it gone from the driveway and not returned until early afternoon. She never asked. The first time, I assumed there'd been some confusion. The second time, I thought I should say something. The third time, I went into the guest room and took the spare key off the hook inside the door where she'd hung it, and I put it in my pocket, and I went and sat in the garden. On the fourth morning, when I heard her come downstairs at 8 and rummage around in the entryway, where she had apparently expected the spare key to still be, I came out of the kitchen and said, quite pleasantly, that I'd need the car that day and going forward would prefer to be asked in advance if she needed transportation. She looked at me with that gathering expression again and said she thought I was home most days anyway. I said that was true, and it was still my car. She called Marcus right there in the entryway while I was standing 3 feet away, and I could hear him on the other end saying he'd talk to me. He never talked to me. He did, however, start driving Diane to appointments twice that week, which I considered a reasonable and appropriate solution that had been available to them all along. I want to tell you about Diane's sister, Patricia. Patricia was 2 years younger than Diane, with more confidence and less charm, which made her almost impossible to deflect in ordinary social situations because she had mastered the art of making requests sound like observations. She arrived on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks into the arrangement, unannounced, with a rolling suitcase and the clear expectation that I had been informed of her visit by someone who had, in fact, not informed me at all. She stood on my porch and told me she'd heard I had some extra space, and she was in between situations. That was the phrase, in between situations. And she thought it would be nice to visit while Diane and Marcus were here. She said, visit the way people say words they have preemptively decided are accurate. She meant stay. She meant live for an indefinite period. I looked at her suitcase. I looked at her. I said, Patricia, I wasn't told you were coming. She said she thought Marcus had mentioned it. I said he had not. She made the expression of mild social inconvenience that functions as an apology in certain family cultures. Then she said she was sure we could figure something out, and she reached for her suitcase handle. I did not move aside. I said, I'm sorry you've made the trip, but the house is full. Marcus and Diane are in the guest room, and I have no other space set up for visitors. This was technically true in every way that mattered. She said, Diane said you have a pullout in the living room. I do have a pullout in the living room, which is in my living room, in my house, and which I had not offered. Patricia settled into a different register. She said that families should be willing to help each other, and that she'd heard I was comfortable financially, and that actually, and here the conversation turned in the direction I had anticipated since she appeared on the porch, she was in a bit of a bind. She needed a loan, not a large one, relatively speaking. She gave me a number. She said it was temporary, she'd repay it. She just needed a bridge to get to a point where things were more stable. She said it the way people say it when they have already spent the loan in their minds. I considered her for a long moment. Patricia had the look of someone who had gotten a great many things by simply outlasting people's resistance, and who had identified me, on this porch on this Wednesday, as a person who might cave under social pressure if she maintained the right combination of warmth and need. She was recalculating in real time, as I didn't respond immediately, and I could see it. The slight recalibration of tone, the softening around the eyes, the lean toward the familiar. You understand what family means territory. I said, Patricia, I appreciate you being direct. I'm going to be equally direct. I won't be lending money to anyone right now, and I won't have another person staying in this house. Those are my limits. I mean no unkindness by them. She tried several more sentences. I let her finish each one. My answer did not change. After approximately 10 minutes, she picked up her suitcase, and I helped her call a rideshare from my phone because hers had a cracked screen, and I waited with her until the car came. We did not speak much while we waited, and when the car arrived, I told her I hoped things worked out for her. I meant it. But I meant it as a human being who hopes for good things in the world, not as a person who was about to reorganize her finances around Patricia's definition of family. My savings are mine. That is not a complicated or controversial sentence. And yet I think there are a great many women in this world who have been made to feel that saying it is a form of selfishness. I want to be very clear. The money I have saved over a working life of 28 years and a shared life of 31 years, and the money that came to me through the careful planning of the man I was married to, is for me. It is for my heating bill, and my doctor, and the trip to Portugal I've been thinking about since Richard died, and the watercolor class and the good olive oil. It is not a family fund. It is not a community chest. It is not an early inheritance. I have not died. I am simply done. After Patricia left, I stood in my garden for a long time. The beans were finishing. The last of the tomatoes were cracked and a little past their best. Everything was winding down for the season, going quiet in the way October goes quiet in this part of the world. Not abruptly, but with a long, slow exhalation. I thought about how long I'd let things expand into the space I should have held for myself, and I did not feel angry about it. I felt strangely tender toward the person I'd been. Someone who believed that generosity was always the right reflex, who had never questioned whether the people receiving it were spending it well. I went back inside. I looked at the reading room door. I looked at the hallway. And then I looked at the coat closet near the front entrance where Diane had, at some point in the second week, moved an entire rack of her clothes. Not the closet in the guest room. She didn't feel it was large enough. But my coat closet where I kept my own jackets, my winter coats, my umbrella collection, and the good leather bag I'd had since my 40s. I opened the closet. I unhooked the rack and wheeled it carefully to the doorway of the guest room where I left it in the hall. I took my coats back. I hung them on their hooks. I found my leather bag on the floor behind the rack where it had been pushed, and I brushed it off and put it on the shelf where it belonged. Then I reorganized the closet as I'd always kept it. 4 seasonal coats, the umbrella stand, the top shelf for guest items. That took about 20 minutes. Diane came upstairs and found the rack in the hallway and found me in the living room with a cup of tea, and she said, "And I will reproduce this precisely because the precision matters. You moved my things into the hallway. I moved them to the doorway of the guest room," I said. "That seemed like the most convenient place. My clothes were organized in that closet." "My coats were in that closet first," I said. "I should have said something earlier. I'm saying it now." I took a sip of tea. She stared at me. This was not the soft social discomfort of finding a lock changed. This was something louder, more exposed, the look of someone whose operating system is encountering a file it does not know how to process. She said, with a sharpness she had not used on me directly before, "You have been making things difficult for us since day one. First the food, then the locks, then the Wi-Fi, and now you're physically removing my belongings from spaces I was using." "Spaces you were using without asking?" I said, in the same tone I would use to note that it was raining. "That's how it works when you're family," she said. "Being family means being welcome here," I said. "It doesn't mean this is your house." There was a silence that had a different quality from the others. Something broke in it. Not dramatically, not with crying or shouting, but something structural gave way. I could see it in the set of her face. She had reached the limit of the tools she had available, and the tools had not worked, and she did not have a strategy for what came next. She turned and walked into the guest room and closed the door. I finished my tea. What broke first was not the relationship between Diane and me. That had been, at best, a managed neutrality for 3 years. What broke first was the relationship between Diane and Marcus. I heard them that night. Not clearly, the walls of the lake house are old and solid, but the shape of the conversation came through. 2 people who had been managing a shared story and whose story had stopped working, and who were now arguing not about logistics, but about who had made the decisions that led here. I heard Marcus's voice, low and effortful. I heard Diane's voice, higher and more insistent. I heard a door, then quiet. In the morning, Marcus came to find me at the breakfast table. He looked the way people look when they have not slept and have also made a decision. He sat across from me and he said, "I think Diane is going to need to leave for a while, to give us space to think." He said it the way someone says a thing they've been rehearsing. That still doesn't quite sound natural. I nodded. I asked if he was all right. He said he didn't entirely know. I told him he was welcome to stay. Diane packed that afternoon. I did not observe the packing, but I was in the house, and the sound of it moved through the rooms like weather. Drawers, bags, the wheels of the rolling suitcase on the hardwood. At 4:15, I heard the front door. I heard a car. A rideshare, not Marcus's, which was in the driveway. And then I heard nothing. I set down the book I was holding. I'd not actually been reading it. I sat with the silence for a long time, and I want to describe what that silence felt like because I think it is important and because it is the thing I had been moving toward without knowing it. Since the morning I sat on the porch with my coffee and watched the dragonfly land on the railing. It was not triumph. It was not even relief exactly. It was the specific silence of a space that belongs entirely to you again. The way a room sounds different when it's yours. The way the air settles differently when no one else is managing it. I made tea. I opened all the windows. The lake was going golden flat in the late afternoon, and I sat with it as long as I wanted. Marcus stayed another 10 days. He was quieter than he'd been in years, and in that quietness, I found my son again. The one who used to sit with his father and not need to fill every silence. The one who helped without being asked. The one who washed his dish and made his bed and said thank you for things. We had breakfast together. We took 2 walks around the lake. We did not talk very much about Diane, and when we did, it was in the language of 2 adults who both understood that some situations become what they become without a single decisive wrongdoing. Through accumulation, through choices, through the quiet, slow pressure of compatible and incompatible things pressing against each other for too long. On his last evening, he sat with me on the back porch and said, "I know I let some things go too far." He did not enumerate them. He didn't need to. I knew what he meant, and he knew I knew. I told him I loved him, and that was true, and that the door was always open to him, and that was also true. I meant the door, not as a symbol. He is my child, and I will always let him in. I mean only that the terms of the letting in are mine to set, because the house is mine, because I am still here, because I am still very much a person. He called me a month later and asked if he could bring a friend for Thanksgiving. He said it the way you say something you half expect will be declined, with that particular up note at the end, the small auditory bracing. I said, of course. "Come Wednesday evening if you like, so we have Thursday morning to cook together." He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Yeah, I'd really like that." He sounded younger than he had in years. I think he was. The holiday was good, genuinely good, not the kind of good that has really managed tension in a different outfit. We cooked together, Marcus and I, the way we hadn't since he was still living at home and Richard was the one who made the gravy. His friend was pleasant and easy, a man about his own age who had grown up helping in his grandmother's kitchen and who fell naturally into the rhythm of the day without needing to be directed. We ate at a reasonable hour. We cleaned up together. That night, I sat by the fire alone after they'd gone to bed, and I held a glass of wine, and I looked at the ceiling of my own house, and I thought about how clean everything felt. Not because I had done something remarkable, because I'd done something simple finally. I had told the truth about what was mine and what wasn't, and I had held that truth without apology, and on the other side of it, my life had come back to me. That is all. That is everything. What I learned through all of it, through the birthday mug, and the locked rooms, and the bank statement, and the closet, and Patricia on the porch, and the night Diane's rolling suitcase went down the hall, is not something that requires a long explanation, but it requires an honest one. I learned that I had been generous from a place of fear. Not entirely. There was real love in it, real pleasure in giving. But underneath the generosity was a fear of being seen as difficult, as cold, as the kind of woman who withholds. I had been raised in the tradition of women who smooth things over, who absorb, who give, who manage. And those women are not weak. That tradition contains enormous strength. But the smoothing can become, if you are not careful, a form of disappearance. You give so much that the outline of what is yours grows vague. The house stops feeling like yours. The kitchen stops feeling like yours. Your mornings, your food, your car, your quiet. You share all of it before anyone asks because the alternative is the terrible discomfort of seeming like a person with limits. I am a person with limits. I have found that they do not make me less generous. They make my generosity real. What I give now, I choose. No one is drawing down an account I didn't open for them. No one is expecting a policy I never wrote. When Marcus comes, it is because I've invited him, and he comes as a person who understands the difference between a guest and a resident, and the visits are warm in a way they never quite were when the arrangement was tangled with obligation and resentment and access I'd never actually granted. There is a sentence I want to give you, and I want you to take it with you whether you are 67 or 34 or somewhere in between. Your home is not a gift you owe anyone. Your savings are not a fund you maintain for other people's emergencies. Your time, your peace, your patience, these are not infinite resources to be drawn on without accounting. You are allowed to keep some things for yourself. You are allowed to change a lock, move your groceries, close an account, refuse a loan, stand on your own porch and say quietly, no. Not because you don't love the people asking, but because you do love yourself finally with the same quiet seriousness you have always loved everyone else. Your peace is not a guest room. There are no visiting hours for the life you have earned. If this story reached you today, If some part of it made you set your phone down for a second and just breathe, I would very much like to hear about it. Leave me a comment below. Tell me what it was that landed, or share your own story if you have one, because I read every single one of them. And I think there is something that happens when women of a certain age speak honestly to each other across whatever distance separates us. Something clarifying, something that makes the next hard decision a little less heavy. If you are new here, please consider subscribing. I tell these stories because I needed to hear them once, and no one was telling them, and I decided that was a problem I could fix. Like this video if it helped you in any way, even a small way. And know that whatever you are navigating right now, you are not alone in it. And you are not unreasonable for wanting what is yours to remain yours. I will be here next time with another story. Thank you for spending this one with me.